All right, let's look at how government and police tackle mass killings and organised violent crime. And to take me through this conversation is Chad Thomas, IRS forensic investigator. Chad, good to speak to you this afternoon. Obviously, tough times that we're up against. 18 people having been shot dead, brutally for that matter, in Lusikisiki. Now, before we get into the first question around, is this organised crime or is it not? One seems to get the impression that many South Africans, or certainly many perpetrators, are a law unto themselves.
Good afternoon, Hugo, and good afternoon to the viewers. Yeah, South Africa is somewhat of a criminal's playground at the moment, and this is simply because we have to deploy so many resources to so many different places. Crime isn't an urban problem, it isn't a peri-urban problem, it isn't just a rural problem, it's everywhere. And we're seeing the Eastern Cape's crime statistics up there with other places like KwaZulu-Natal, the Western Cape, Gauteng, and it's becoming worse. And this is simply because we can't be everywhere at once. We see the state throwing resources at different crimes when they become very problematic. So we saw a lot of focus on ATM bombing, then on CRT heists, then on zama-zamas, then on kidnap for ransom, then on extortion. But of course, when one hears of 18 people killed from two family homesteads, it brings home the reality to the rest of South Africa that murder is a massive, massive problem in South Africa, where more than 70 people are losing their lives on a daily basis.
Chad, the one thing that I suppose concerns me is, what is the real problem, right? Is it unemployment? There have been schools of thought that have suggested that the levels of crime that we are experiencing at the moment are a result of unemployment in this country. But South Africa is not the only country that has unemployment numbers that are at these sort of figures, 33, 34%. There are other countries on the African continent that have similar numbers. So what is the core problem, and are we able to tackle that core problem?
At this point in time, the state can't tackle the problem head on simply because there aren't sufficient trained investigators on the ground to investigate, and there aren't enough prosecutors to prosecute. When one looks at Operation Chanela, the minister very proudly announced yesterday that 53,000 people had been arrested over the past 4 weeks. 53,000 people, that means 53,000 cases that they are linked to. Those cases have to be investigated for those arrests to become prosecutable and for those people to then be held in a prison. We heard last year in Operation Chanela that in total 600,000 people were arrested, but our prison population rests around the 120, 130, maybe at the maximum 140,000 mark. So where are these people going? We then heard out of Parliament the ex-Minister of Police, Minister Becky Cele, announcing that in an answer to a question in Parliament, that 5 million dockets have been closed as undetected over 5 years. And that should answer the question right there and then. If 5 million dockets are closed as undetected, it means that we don't have sufficient, well-trained detectives able to take these arrests and turn them into actionable prosecutions. It also means that our prosecutors are cherry-picking dockets that they know are winnable. So the majority of cases are not getting enrolled. The cases are being withdrawn against the suspects because there simply isn't enough evidence. And the reason there isn't enough evidence is because our detectives don't have enough time, nor do they have the tools or infrastructure to be able to make a case prosecutable. So what we're finding is a very, very low rate of conviction of cases that are reported to the South African Police Services. And despite the fact that there's a high rate of arrests, we're not seeing that translate into prosecutions.
All right, so let's come back to Lusikisiki, because it almost seems like this is a bit of a vicious circle, if you will. So this is a rural community. 18 people, 17 people died immediately, and then the other individual was taken to hospital and subsequently died. Does this have hallmarks of organised crime?
Not necessarily. We've seen in the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, Eastern Cape, what we call in the old days faction fights. In Europe, they refer to them as feudal-type warring. In other countries, they refer to it as vendetta, where there's a grudge between different homesteads, different families, and different groups of individuals. This by the sounds of things, was a crime that was planned. The way in which the people were killed, the majority were shot in the head, was execution styles. It means that it wasn't a crime that was committed in the heat of the moment. It was planned. It was well thought out. People were executed literally by having guns placed against their heads. But without the evidence coming out, it would be very difficult to speculate. But understanding the problems we've seen in rural KwaZulu-Natal, rural Eastern Cape, previously where there's been similar such instances, one would expect that the evidence may lead to arrests in respect of a warring family ongoing feud. However, there could be other reasons for this. And the evidence is going to have to talk to this. And that's why it's so important that they have the boots on the ground that are trained to be able to process that crime scene in such a manner and fashion that they have actionable evidence that they can arrest the perpetrators.
Chad, could this tragedy be symptomatic of a broader issue? I suppose you've said it's not organised crime, but if whatever sort of crime it is, if so, what steps can the government take to dismantle these networks or deal with these feuds, if it indeed is a feud of sorts?
So whether it was a feud, whether it was organised crime, whether it was an opportunistic criminal, whether it was something planned, there's one thing that we need to bear in mind in South Africa. Criminals feel that there's little to no chance that they're going to be held to account for their crimes. We don't see the consequences that one should be seeing when we're living in such a violent society. When people go to prison, we've seen how they are treated in prison. We've seen how they're living it up in prison. And of late, we've seen a lot more raids on prisons that have shown just to what extent these people are what one could term living la vida loca. They have cell phones, they have portable stoves, they have all the trappings of a comfortable lifestyle. We even heard that in some cells they found PlayStations. Now, that's not much of a deterrent. In some instances, when you look at the criminal profile, a lot of your criminals that are starting at the bottom of the run, prison is actually a step up from the type of conditions that they're living in. So we don't give much of a message in terms of the way in which criminals are treated in South Africa. When they go to prison, we don't see much rehabilitation taking place, and we've noted a growing trend over the years for repeat offenders. We need to start looking at our prison system. We need to start looking at how we treat these hardened criminals. And it's called hard time for a reason. When you go to prison, it's not to take a break from your criminal activities, learn a bit more from those that you're in prison with, come out more emboldened and more informed and more educated as into how to commit crime. You should either come out rehabilitated, that you can become an asset to society, or you should come out so scared that you never want to commit a crime again. And unfortunately, those are the two things that are lacking in our criminal justice system at the moment. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. That's number one. And number two, criminals actually don't give a damn whether they're in prison or not, because they have a certain lifestyle that they become accustomed to, and they know that their families are looked after outside.
So when you look at how criminals are incarcerated or kept overseas, there seems to be a different school of thought in certain countries, especially if you look at a few of the Nordic countries, right? The focus is to rehabilitate those criminals so they don't get into prison and feel, oh my goodness, I want to get out of here tomorrow, right? But it's almost you're in this place, you could come out a better person, study this, study that, acquire a certain number of skill sets. Are you convinced that life should be as tough as possible for criminals when they get into prison?
I watched with utter disbelief the way Thabo Bester spoke to the court recently, demanding certain comforts within the criminal justice system, demanding that as an incarcerated prisoner he has access to certain things, complaining about the way in which he was being kept. He shouldn't be complaining. That's the way people should be kept. We need to have different levels of prisons, which we do have. We have them notated as medium. So you have a maximum all the way through to a different level of prison to house different types of prisoners. But we need to see chain gangs. We need to see those prisoners giving back to society by doing something, whether it's working in the fields, whether it's doing something. And we also need to see workshops established within those environments. When one talks about the Nordic model, they don't have the levels of violent crime that South Africa has. So our prisoners are something different. Our criminals are a lot of repeat offenders. They're very violent offenders. We need to impose some kind of structure. We need to hope for rehabilitation, but we know that in the short and medium term, we're not going to be rehabilitating a lot of these prisoners. Too much damage has been done. The system is close to broken within that environment. And although we've got this renewed energy within the criminal justice cluster, specifically within the police and within correctional services, we can see changes most probably in the long term. But in the short and medium term, we need to be sending a clear message to hardened criminals that if they go to prison, they're going to be doing hard time, and it's called hard time for a specific reason.
Maybe they should make you police minister, Chad. But very quickly, before we let you go, Senzo Mchunu has been in office a few months. Do you get the sense that there's a shake-up in the system?
Definitely. I'm loving what he's saying. I'm loving the energy. He spoke in Parliament. He asked for the budget to be increased to 189 billion rand, which the police desperately need to be able to capacitate specifically detective services. Groenewald is doing a brilliant job in correctional services. And if we can see this kind of momentum continue, we are going to turn the corner as South Africans.
Fantastic, Chad. Appreciate your time. Great speaking to you. Chad Thomas, IRS forensic investigator, giving us his lowdown on those killings in Lusikisiki.